officially launch this event. So with that, I think that it's a 2:05 Geneva time, so let's officially launch this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to this event, launching a new report, Climate Impacts of Plastics, Global Actions to Stem Climate Change and End Plastic Pollution, produced by GRID-Arendal. This new report that was presented at the United Nations Environment Assembly a couple of weeks ago seeks to identify options for measures and strengthen governmental accountability in addressing the climate impacts of plastics. It aims to maximize the climate benefits of the plastics instrument, delineating responsibilities in conjunction with other climate-agreed instruments. Let's start by congratulating the GRID-Arendal project team for this new document and for choosing the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues for the launch. These dialogues have kept the international community in Geneva and beyond engaged on this topic since the end of 2020, making links with various international processes. The dialogues are organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, IUCN, Norway, Switzerland, the Forum on Train, Environment and the SDGs, known as TESS, and the University of Geneva. This third series of dialogues kick off after the adoption 2 years ago of a historical resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop this international legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution will meet for its fourth session, referred to as INC4, in April in Ottawa, Canada. Many attendees today will be present in Ottawa next month. So taking place during the intersessional period ahead of this INC4 meeting, today's dialogue is co-organized with the GRID-Arendal team. And before you are formally welcome, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available on the webpage of this event. The link is being shared in the chat. And throughout the event, you can raise questions by using the Q&A box. We have a dedicated session to answer these if time allows. Otherwise, you will see that the authors of the report will be engaging with you in the Q&A box. So moving now to the opening session of this event, we are delighted to be joined by His Excellency Ambassador Luc Daunivalu, the permanent representative of Fiji to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva. Among the many positions that His Excellency Ambassador Daunivalu has had prior to his current position, he was chief negotiator on climate change under Fiji's presidency of the 23rd Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Fiji is a country that is facing the consequences of two crises covered by our discussion today, leading with the impacts of climate change and of plastic pollution, and at the forefront of diplomatic action to tackle this crisis. So after the welcoming remarks, Caroline Birbeck, the director of the executive, the executive director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs will moderate the event. So it's now our pleasure to turn to His Excellency Ambassador Luc Daunivalu. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Diana. And let me also extend my thanks to the Geneva Environment Network for the invitation to offer some remarks in this particular part of the event, and appreciate the opportunity to be part of this discussion, which is important, addressing the climate impacts of plastics, and really commend the organizers for bringing together the distinguished panel and all the participants who are here with us today. All of us have been witness to the scourge of the plastic problem on our oceans, on our environment, and its impact on our health and the health of our people. But the launch of the climate impact of plastics report is indeed timely. It casts a revealing light on the symbiosis between our global fight against climate change and the imperative to decarbonize plastic production, whose life cycle, as all of you know, consumes substantial fossil fuel resources for its energy-intensive production. Grounded in rigorous scientific inquiry, the report illuminates a stark reality. Gases spewed from the entire plastic life cycle contribute an estimated 3.8% to 4.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions. The report is therefore a clarion call to each of us to be the vanguard and to step up our collective efforts in this campaign. Mission to eliminate plastic pollution demands a comprehensive strategy that embraces the full spectrum of plastics life cycle. I know many of us are doing work in this regard. Some of the things that Fiji is doing, one within the World Trade Organization, Fiji has raised its voice in pivotal dialogues on fossil fuel subsidy reform, the discourse on plastic pollution. These initiatives are the vanguards in the battle to integrate the trade aspects of plastic pollution and climate change into the global agenda. The recent WTO Ministerial Conference in Abu Dhabi, some of you might have been there, commitments of profound relevance to this discourse were made. One, the champions of fossil fuel subsidy reform, numbering about 50, pledged to delineate the most harmful subsidies, exposing their environmental and trade detriments while rallying support for their reforms and eventual eradication. Secondly, the proponents of the dialogue on plastic pollution committed to reduce the tide of environmentally detrimental, health hazardous, or unnecessary single-use plastics and packaging. In the United Nations Environment Assembly, Fiji has been involved in the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee's endeavor to forge an international legally binding instrument to combat plastic pollution. I'm glad to know that many of you are involved in that negotiations. The path to consensus, as you all know, is fraught with resistance, and we have also seen that resistance in climate change negotiations and more recently in the WTO fisheries negotiations. Common thread weaving through these dialogues is the pervasive reliance on fossil fuels, a reliance that, while fueling our productive capacities, at the same time inflicts devastating and lasting harm upon our planet. So how can we inspire positive outcomes in the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee that is ongoing? Here, a profound grasp of the plastic life cycle and its myriad activities is indispensable for the INC. Presently, it just seems that much of the negotiations are driven by theoretical knowledge or based on what we have read. However, the knowledge and understanding required to make real impact in the negotiations need to be grounded in reality in terms of how we examine this life cycle in our national and regional contexts. The important aspect underscored by the report is the absence of universally endorsed definitions and harmonized terminology, which, as you would appreciate, pose significant difficulties in pinpointing and articulating strategies to mitigate the climate impacts of plastics. Herein is the convergence point between UNEA's Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, the UNFCCC's Conference of Parties, and the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment Processes. This nexus demands unequivocal definitions, measures, or the actions that are required. Such clarity is essential to foster a shared understanding of the intricate interplay between plastic pollution, climate change, and the interventions required for their amelioration. It is upon this platform shared understanding that we must construct our negotiations. And this is the final point that I want to make. For only when we do that can we hope to wield transformative impact in our pursuit to cleanse our world of plastic pollution, work to address or avert the climate crisis. I'm looking forward to the discussions, to hearing a bit more about the report. I regret that I won't be here for the entirety of the session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us today. And thank you also, Diana, for opening this session today. It's my great pleasure to be here to help support the launch and panel discussion of this new report on climate impacts of plastics. Thank you, Ambassador, for those opening remarks and for setting the scene for us, and especially by highlighting the disproportionate impact of both plastic pollution and climate change on Fiji, on the Pacific Islands, and indeed on the broad range of small island developing states. In your remarks, you've really highlighted the pervasive reliance on fossil fuels in the plastics economy and the range of impacts across the life cycle, but also the importance of understanding the different national and regional contexts in which plastics are used and how this will influence the kind of measures that could be taken. So in your remarks, you also highlighted how reports such as the one that is going to be launched today can help negotiators and policymakers and stakeholders by helping to identify and shed light on some of the key trends and impacts, but also to help build shared understandings of some of the actions and measures that may need to be taken to address these impacts. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the authors of this report from GRID-Arendal. I have had the opportunity to review the report, and I think it does a great job of highlighting very specifically the connections between climate change and plastics. And I would note that these are increasingly recognized on the international stage, both in the context of the plastics negotiations. Many governments highlight the importance of reflecting on and contributing also to the climate agenda. And in the COP28 as well was one of the first times that we saw the importance of plastics as a sector being highlighted by a range of actors. So to introduce the report, I'm really delighted to give the floor to Natalia Skripnikova, who is an expert in transboundary governance and environmental crime at GRID-Arendal, and she will introduce their report, followed by some of her colleagues also from who've contributed to the report. So you have the floor, Natalia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's a great honor for us to present the report to very distinguished guests and speakers. We would like to thank Geneva Environment Network for hosting this webinar. We are very much looking forward to the panel discussion later today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us online in front of your screens. And we can move to the next slide, please. And the next slide. Here you can see the report and summary for policymakers. Now we can move to the next slide. I would like to start the presentation about our report with the aim of our work. The aim of our report was to identify options for measures and strengthen governmental accountability in addressing the climate impacts of plastics. We had three objectives. Firstly, we needed to identify the existing plastics climate efforts and provide additional options strengthening the accountability of governments to address plastic pollution and climate change at the global level. Secondly, we required to provide measures that could contribute to maximizing climate benefits through the Global Plastics Instrument. And thirdly, we aspired to improve institutional capacity to jointly minimize the effects on climate change across the plastics life cycle at national and global levels, including relevant multilateral environmental agreements and the United Nations entities. Can we move to the next slide, please? The report is based on the extensive literature review. We also carried out an empirical study, which includes the analysis of the report submitted by the parties under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, as well as member states' written submissions prior to the INC3 on plastic pollution. We also carried out the analysis of official documents prepared by the INC Secretariat, performed database assessment to figure out available data on greenhouse gas emissions from plastics, and reviewed MEA's obligations related to the impacts of plastics on climate change. In our presentation, we would like to highlight the main parts of the report. The technical foundation, which synthesizes the latest available scientific evidence of drivers of climate change across the plastics life cycle, the results of the empirical part, and propose measures for optimizing climate benefits across the plastics life cycle and possible institutional collaboration. And now I would like to hand over to my colleague Irene to take us through the technical foundation of the report. Irene, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalia and Carolyn, for the introduction. I will further touch upon the topics mentioned in His Excellency Ambassador Luke's opening remarks highlighted in our report. The technical foundation explores the impacts on climate change through various stages of the plastic life cycle. The life cycle stages identified in this report include sourcing of raw materials, production of plastics, plastics use and reuse, and waste management. In addition, the report looks at plastic pollution in the environment. In 2015, the plastic life cycle was estimated to collectively contribute to about 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalents, accounting for 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions that year. However, this number excludes multiple activities such as greenhouse gas leakages from sourcing materials and greenhouse gas emissions from the plastic use stage. In addition, with plastic production numbers continuously growing and plastic currently being the fastest growing material in the global economy, these numbers are expected to and have most likely already increased. The figure you can see on the screen illustrates how each of the plastic life cycle stages contribute to climate change. Next slide, please. We also aimed in this study to clarify a delineation between those emissions that can be directly attributed to plastics and those that are indirectly attributable. This would allow for greater clarification on which control measures would fall under the new plastics instrument and which should be strengthened under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. We found that of the 94% of emissions resulting from sourcing and production stages combined, 41% of those emissions are directly related to plastics themselves, whereas 59% of those emissions was related to electricity generation, fossil fuels extraction, transport, and other operational activities. There is therefore a great opportunity to focus on climate change within the new plastics instrument. I will now go more into detail on the different plastic life cycle stages. Next slide, please. Sourcing of feedstocks account for approximately 9% of the total greenhouse gas emissions from the plastic life cycle. The majority of plastics, about 90%, is derived from fossil-based feedstocks. Emissions in this stage are therefore mostly linked to oil and gas production and coal mining, both associated with significant greenhouse gas emissions, including CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, among others. Notably, the current estimates of methane emissions from these industries are likely underestimated by 25 to 40%. The production stage of plastic accounts for approximately 85% of the greenhouse gas emissions, encompassing refining, cracking, polymerization, and conversion processes involved in the creation of finished products. The refining of fossil fuels is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions and constitute about 40% of emissions from the oil and gas industry. Extracted fossil fuels are converted into naphtha and ethane, which is then mainly subjected to steam cracking processes to transform them into monomers that serve as the primary chemicals in the plastic industry. The monomers are combined to create polymers in a process called polymerization. The conversion stage from monomers to finished polymers accounts for 30% of emissions from the plastic life cycle. These polymers are then mixed with a range of chemical compounds and additives designed to enhance their performance, each polymer undergoing different production methods which ultimately determine their greenhouse gas emissions. Notably, for more complex polymers like polystyrene, greenhouse gas emissions are usually higher than other less complex polymers. Plastic production heavily relies on fossil fuels for energy. Processes such as refining and cracking demand substantial energy, and the choice of fuel play a crucial role in the overall greenhouse gas footprint of plastic production. The chemical and petrochemical industries, integral to the plastic production, utilize about 10% of global energy use, with significant oil and gas consumption representing 14% and 8% of global primary demand, respectively. The major driver of greenhouse gas emissions is associated with the increased combustion of coal for electricity and heat supply during plastic production. In 2015, 6% of global coal electricity was used for plastic production. contributing substantially to the greenhouse gas emissions from this stage. Mainly, many high-income countries rely on plastic production from coal-based economies in low-income regions. Next slide, please. Rapid economic growth has led to increased plastic consumption worldwide, with packaging dominating 36% of our global demand. Plastic packaging designed for short-term use has an average lifespan of less than a year, and often comprise of products that are difficult to recycle. Creating substitutes for single use can potentially only shift environmental issues and create new issues. And product redesign is currently based on limited examples, particularly at the large scale. However, reusing a high-density polyethylene bottle instead of a single-use PET bottle may reduce CO2 emissions by 65%. However, around 30% of plastic packaging may never be reused or recycled without fundamental redesign. Although consumption patterns at the end-user level through actions and purchasing habits are important to consider in order to reduce and reuse plastics, there is a lack of connections between governance forms, market structures, materials, and technology that contribute to feeding the strong carbon lock-ins of plastics. Recent estimates, next slide please, by the way. Recent estimates show that the waste management stage, including recycling, disposal, and incineration, contribute to around 6% of overall emissions of the plastic life cycle. As greenhouse gases deriving from waste management does not account for open burning and mismanaged plastic waste, the total greenhouse gas emissions are assumed to be higher. Inadequate waste services and uncontrolled disposal may result in open burning, emitting greenhouse gases, but also black carbon with a warming potential up to 5,000 times greater than CO2. Recycling is the most efficient waste management among those mentioned. Plastic bottle recycling can cut emissions by 30% compared to landfilling, and over 40% compared to incineration. Notably, producing a plastic bottle from recycled PET uses 1.7 times less energy than from primary polymers. Chemical conversion comprises different technologies, but in general, the latest literature shows that emissions can range from 2 to 9 times higher than those from mechanical recycling. Waste incineration is the most emission-intensive waste management option among those mentioned. In addition, emissions of reactive trace gases and particulate matter from open burning are not currently included in inventories, despite their significant climate impact. Countries are increasingly moving away from landfilling waste and towards substantial investment in waste incineration with energy generation. This transition commits to technology lock-ins that rely on long-term consistent flow of feedstocks, including plastic waste. Next slide, please. A significant amount of plastic waste has accumulated in the environment. Found globally in all corners of our planet, including our mountains and polar regions, microplastic have been reported to reduce snow and ice reflectivity, which in turn accelerates climate effects. Plastic degradation through processes such as photodegradation emits greenhouse gases like methane and ethylene, especially from low-density plastics. Plastic pollution exacerbates climate change through various feedback loops, affecting marine and terrestrial environments, as well as atmospheric processes like cloud formation. Most studies have currently focused on these feedback loops of plastics in the environment, but there is still a large gap on the direct linkages between climate change and plastic pollution, both in the marine and terrestrial environment. Next slide, please. Thank you. I would now like to invite Natalia back, which will discuss the main findings of the empirical part of the report.
Thank you so much, Erin. The empirical part consists of 2 studies. Firstly, the analysis of the documents submitted to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and secondly, the submissions to the INCS3 process. The next slide, please. We analyzed 219 documents in English submitted by the parties to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. The documents include national determined contributions, biennial reports, and biennial update reports. These submissions are meant to inform about the efforts which countries undertake to reduce emissions, as well as update about the actions and status of greenhouse gas emissions. Based on the results of the analysis, we can say that the current reporting practice does not provide a systematized approach for tracking plastic-related greenhouse gas emissions, as well as to account the plastic's contribution to climate change and to assess the effectiveness of mitigation actions to reduce emissions associated with plastics. And now I'm going to explain why. The next slide, please. We looked into 4 main strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions relevant for plastics. On the slide, you can see the summary of actions and efforts countries reported in pursuit of these strategies. These strategies are decarbonization, emissions reduction, energy efficiency, and circularity. For example, under decarbonization, we see that countries mainly improve industrial processes and use of new technologies, as well as pay attention to developing of low-carbon roadmaps and policies. However, it is important to say that the review of these strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions relevant for plastics is only possible at a broader scale and encompasses the petrochemical and chemical industries. The analysis of the strategies revealed one of the critical gaps of the current reporting practice. The national submissions lack the necessary level of detail and do not specifically report on efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the plastics industry. We identified that the current reporting mainly approaches the plastics industry as an integral element of the petrochemical and chemical industries. This prevents from a more detailed analysis of the plastics industry as an area of intervention for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The next slide, please. Then we analyzed how plastics have been reported across life cycle in the documents. On the slide, you can see the summary of identified efforts and actions following the logic of the life cycle. We also added a post-value chain stage known as plastics in the environment. Based on the results, we can say that the coverage of plastics life cycle stages varies in the reports, putting more emphasis on plastics at the waste management stage while having little information about other stages. It is necessary to highlight that the fragmented coverage of plastics life cycle stages in the UNFCCC reports complicates the traceability of plastics' contribution to climate change. In addition, the analysis revealed that the coverage of energy used in plastics production constitutes a gap in the reporting, which prevents transparency and accountability of plastics' impact on climate. The next slide, please. Yes, thank you. What else do we know about plastics from the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement? Additionally, our analysis identified a list of reported polymers. As you can see, this list is relatively short. We also examined other types of plastics and can say that there are no clear definitions for bio-based, biodegradable, compostable, biomass plastics, and bioplastics. We also managed to investigate plastics through a sectoral approach. The next slide, please. Here you can see the list of 11 sectors recognizing plastics in the context of climate change. The analysis of plastics through sectoral approach also exposed critical gaps. We observed that the sectors that are considered to be the major users or producers of plastics are underrepresented when it comes to their reporting on emissions associated with plastics. For example, textiles are known to be one of the main users of plastics. However, the reports have a very limited information about this sector in relationship to plastic. We found a variety of measures that could be attributed to polymers and transport, but all of them are focused only on one product type, tires. The next slide. Yes, thank you. To sum up, it is important to remember that some countries are already reporting on plastics in the context of climate change. However, the lack of harmonized approaches and requirements on reporting of plastics' climate implications prevents transparency of associated emissions. The next slide, please. The second part of our empirical study was the analysis of the INC3 submissions. I would like to stress that our analysis identified that 125 countries, or if simplified, almost half of the world, which indicated climate considerations in the individual or group submissions. The climate-related elements proposed the most in the submissions were recognition of the impact of plastic pollution on climate change and the co-benefits the plastics instrument would have for addressing climate change. And now I would like to pass the floor to Karen, who will tell us more about measures we propose in our report, as well as areas for institutional collaboration.
Natalia. And firstly, just a big thank you to all the co-authors, including Nico Urho, who's online. And also there's many advisors who have been acknowledged in the report as well. So what we aim to do with this research, as mentioned, is to clearly separate the control measures that would fall under the mandate of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and those measures that would fall under the new plastics instrument. So this diagram shows what you could call a division of mandate, with the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement on the left, and the plastics instrument on the right. So we'll go through these in detail in the following slides, but just to note that on the right, we have grouped the options into the life cycle stages, and at the bottom, we have those measures that apply to both, where collaboration is needed. Next slide, please. So under the plastics instrument, firstly, in the production stage, the most important thing that the agreement needs to do is to reduce the overall production of primary polymers. This has the greatest potential under the plastics instrument to reduce associated greenhouse gas emissions. And this can be achieved through a few of the measures currently in the draft agreement, such as reducing the use of primary polymers. And this can again then be achieved by reducing the demand for primary polymers, by increasing the use of secondary plastics, phasing out problematic and unnecessary and avoidable plastic products. And then the agreement can also reduce the use of primary polymers by promoting the transition to low carbon non-plastic substitutes. But noting that this needs careful life cycle assessment to ensure net environmental benefits. Next slide, please. Also in the production stage, there are options with the design criteria to place more focus on employing low carbon feedstocks and using polymers that have lower net energy requirements across all stages of the life cycle, particularly in the production stage, as we've heard. For example, some polymers have higher heat requirements, and there are also variations in emissions from different additives and catalysts. And then design criteria can promote the use of polymers that are more suitable for reuse and refill systems, and those that are more suitable for mechanical recycling. Design criteria can also require minimizing or elimination of microplastics releases, but overall design criteria can really help us to reduce the need for primary polymers in the first place. Next slide, please. And then in the use stage, here the plastics instrument can help scale up business models for reuse and refill, but it's important to avoid introducing new transport systems that could instead increase greenhouse gas emissions. So the agreement could promote reverse logistics or backloading while we transition to the transport sector to clean and renewable energy. Next slide, please. Then moving into the waste management stage, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by limiting open burning and other forms of mismanagement of plastic waste. This goes back to the design of products to reduce waste generation in the first place, but also to create value for waste so that it's collected and not burned. And just to note that there's very little information on the open burning information on greenhouse gas emissions from that. Under the instrument, criteria or guidelines can also be developed to support a life cycle assessment of waste management facilities towards investment in lower emitting technologies and also avoiding lock-ins to high emitting and expensive technologies. Also then promoting offset of greenhouse gas emissions, but this is the least favored option. And then for the plastics already leaked in from the economy, we can promote remediation of the environment and landfill. Next slide, please. Under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, here we have the greatest potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with plastics by decarbonizing the plastics life cycle, particularly with regards the substantial energy requirements for heat in the production and waste stages, but also focusing on energy for the transport sector. Next slide, please. So under both the plastics instrument and the UNFCCC, they can work together to strengthen transparency and accountability by developing a framework under the plastics instrument to track climate-related measures and allow better disaggregation and reporting of plastic-related greenhouse gas emissions under the UNFCCC. Also to improve reporting by the private sector on their greenhouse gas emissions. And then promoting research, innovation, and low-carbon technology development to expedite the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and to identify low-carbon non-plastic substitutes, feedstocks, polymers, practices, and technologies, but also to identify more environmentally friendly chemical conversion technologies, and really just to remove the uncertainty relating to some of the technologies that we have. Also, there's options to work together to scale sustainable financing from public and private sources to address the climate component of plastics, but mainly to shift investment away from the fossil-based and emission-intensive petrochemical production. And then just to note that all these efforts can further be supported by targeted trade-related measures. Next slide, please. So we also looked at the need for institutional collaboration, and here there is opportunity for sharing data and information on plastics-related greenhouse gas emissions and their sources with the Paris Agreement and the Plastics Instrument, for coordinating policies and measures related to plastics among those MEAs that have broader climate goals and targets, also coordinating research, analysis, and assessment efforts to deepen our understanding of the climate implications of plastics and also to identify mitigation opportunities. The Paris Agreement, as we know, has the opportunity to help decarbonize the plastics life cycle. And here they could work together to provide guidance for preparation of nationally determined contributions and long-term low-emission development strategies. There's also the science policy interface for the plastics instrument, which could work towards deepening our understanding of how plastics intersect with climate change and work with other SPI mechanisms, in particular the IPCC, to strengthen plastics-related knowledge and outcomes. Next slide, please. And then just to summarize, the key activities therefore are under the plastics instrument. They could be to consider greenhouse gas emissions as a plastic pollutant, to reduce production of primary polymers, and to develop design criteria that limit greenhouse gas emissions. Under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, the key aim here is to decarbonize operational activities, which has the greatest potential. And then together, both can expedite research, innovation, and low carbon technology. So with that, I'd like to thank you and hand over to Carolyn.
You're muted, Caroline. So Caroline, just speak here and I...
Okay. My apologies. All of your team that I forgot to introduce all of you properly in the beginning. So we had Aaron Isabella of Waste and Marine Literature. Also, Karen Paulson, a lecturer at the Australian National Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong. So thank you again for having introduced what I think is particularly striking about the report is that it's comprehensive. And so this is not only looking at the linkages between the plastics crisis and the climate crisis, but also looking at what information we're gathering from the different intergovernmental processes in each of those, and helping to identify some of the measures and options that governments receive those for. So thank you very much for that introduction. I think what we should do now is turn to panelists for their reflections on the report. I should note for everyone listening that the presentation will be available online after. For those of you who wish to ask questions, I will encourage you to put them in the Q&A box in the WebEx. So not in the chat, but in the Q&A, and then we can come back to some of the speakers they will provide during the discussion. Before I move to the panel, just a big congratulations to the team from GRID-Arendal for producing this report and helping to keep this issue alive and help to provide some signposts for ways forward for everything. We can do more to address issues going forward. In terms of the panel, Dr. Carl Pullman, who's a doctoral student at the university, is doing excellent work on this topic. Over to you, please, Carl.
Yes. So my name is Carl Holmberg. I'm a doctoral student from Lund University. And me and a team of other researchers at Lund University and University of Copenhagen have together worked on a report that fits in very neatly to the excellent work that Karen, Nico, and the team at GRID-Arendal has worked on, which is called Towards a Global Plastic Treaty, Tracing the New Negotiations. We are a team here at the university who deals a lot with these issues around climate-related, connecting climate and plastic, essentially. So we're very grateful to see the results provided here in the seminar. Next slide, please. So what we did was to go through all the INC2 and INC3 pre-session submissions from member states. And in the first stage of this process, we looked into the stated objective from the member states that they had and quantified what those objectives were, essentially. And we can see here that there is less attention to maybe the most crucial aspect here, reducing production. Caroline, I can hear you typing. Thank you. Yes. While we see more attention to aspects like biodiversity and human health and plastic pollution. Next slide, please. And if we take a step back and look into the whole set of the submissions that we see from the member states, coded into different type of policies throughout the value chain, this is the result in a way, where we can see, you see a spread of policies being suggested, but it's a heavy tilt towards soft and regulatory measures, less so around economic type measures and target type measures. Next slide, please. Divided into crucial coalitions in the INC process over the value chain, you can see that the African group plus its members and IOSIS plus its members, GRULAC plus its members, and a High Ambition Coalition plus its members have a somewhat equal distribution in where they put emphasis in their policy suggestions, while there is a substantial underrepresentation of measures on the upstream, so connected to production, climate, those aspects that we talk about here today. But there's one group that really sticks out in this regard, and it's the so-called like-minded group, which today we know consists of Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and a few other states, where little to none attention can be seen in this regard. Next slide, please. So the takeaway we would like to bring to this discussion is that this review that we did was a review and coding of 182 pre-session submissions, which directly or indirectly representing 170 UN member states in the INC process. The pre-session submissions by member states provides considerably attention to waste management and recycling related issues, while relatively little attention is being given to upstream climate and production related measures. Since we see there is some sort of common ground around waste management and recycling, we can expect these issues to feature heavily in the treaty process that follows, and perhaps also in its final form, with a risk that other parts of the value chain essentially become comparably neglected. However, what we also point towards in our report and what we see here today is that the sheer quantities of plastic being produced each year undermines any efforts either to end plastic pollution or reach any net zero carbon emissions targets. I mean, plastic is very related to climate, the climate change issues as well. So yeah, thank you for me.
So thank you very much, Carl, for that for those reflections. Really useful. As time is short, I'm just going to slide straight on to the next person. We'll have time during the discussion to come back again. So next we have Max Mohammadi, who is the founder and CTO of Plastic Fry, and he's also going to share his comments in 4 or 5 minutes. Please, over to you, Max.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my slides. I hope that it works. Yes, please tell me if you see my screen so I can start.
We do.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Max. I'm one of the co-founders and inventors behind the company called Plastic Free from Sweden. We are a green tech company working with developing a technology platform that offers eco-friendly and plant-based alternative to plastics. So I would like to start with reflection and relevancy of what we do to the valuable report and the great work that has been done. But I want really to highlight mainly 3 aspects, because the other parts we have heard now earlier, and it will be also the other respected panel members that will share their insights. First, I would like to highlight the importance of increasing the use of low carbon non-plastic substitute, because it is a fact that whatever we do in terms of recycling, reusing, still plastic is plastic. In certain application areas, it's not the most sustainable option. Also focusing on the minimizing the release of microplastic, both to the environment, but also to the ecosystem that is beyond just the environment that everybody looks at from an environmental perspective. I will talk more about it soon. And then the last part is really on the political landscape that the report highlights about the Paris Agreement and also how to explicitly recognize greenhouse gas emissions as a formal pollutant. But then also I think important to highlight the financing requirement to enable innovations that can really change the curve. Plastic Free is a great example as a company that is working by really showcasing the power of innovation that can really be applied in a larger scale. And the reason for that, of course, the report talks a lot about the greenhouse gas emissions and the environmental aspects, but also I would like to highlight on the health aspect of plastics, on the fact that more than half of plastic that has ever been manufactured has been manufactured in the past couple of decades. And then if we continue to do this, plastics will outpace coal in driving climate change in 5-6 years time. So we have developed a breakthrough technology. It's a process basically that eliminates toxic chemicals, works on existing machinery and reduce costs. That's why our company has been awarded as the world's most innovative sustainability startup among more than 1,400 companies worldwide. So basically what we do, we use renewable plant resources. We work a lot with agricultural waste, non-edible plants, vegetable oils, and wood fiber to create products that are truly circular without greenwashing, and also referring to the report that really low carbon footprint, but also a bio-based part of the plastic alternative that we can offer. We have 2 categories of products. We work with flexible packagings, the product that you see down there, different types of bags, waste bags, and so on. We also have the fiber-based solutions, where we have both food article and non-food article, like cups, straws, a patented lid, e-commerce mailers, and different types of bags. And here our invention is basically to create, to eliminate the film or laminate that is normally of plastic, and then it is mixed with paper. We have eliminated that, created a functional possibility that you can achieve a specific mechanical property with a monomaterial, which means that it is purely paper, but still very strong. The whole supply chain is built here in Europe. Manufacturing happens with 100% renewable energy and truly unique value proposition that can replace plastic in many of those application areas that we have high carbon footprint. Of course, there is competition, but no one has succeeded to solve sustainability at a reasonable cost. There are plastics, bioplastic, bio-based plastics, and so on, and each of them have shortcomings. So what we have done, we have bridged the gap between sustainability, price, and performance. And most importantly, our products, if they are going to recycling, or if they end up in nature, or at the end of their life, what is important is not only that they are biodegradable, there are all of those claims that you see, but it's also important that they do not, after breaking down, they do not release any type of microplastics or other toxic chemicals that can damage the ecosystem. And of course, we have got a lot of attention, Forbes, CNN, BBC, Yahoo Finance, and so on, for the work we're doing. And it is, I think, very important to highlight the power of innovation and really the solutions that are out there. It's not about diplomas and honors. It's really about creating a change that we really want to see in a whole stakeholder value chain. And I just want to finish up by going back both to the report, but also the core of plastics. The health aspect of plastic is still something that is not very much discussed in the scale it should be. So this is a research report that was published in February this year. Microplastics found in every human placenta, tested in a large study in a University of New Mexico study, very alarming. Another study published in January this year, the normal plastic bottles that almost all of us have unfortunately used and will probably use. It has been now found that they contain up to 400,000 nanoplastics of that. Europe is moving towards reusable category from single use, which is a good movement, but then all of those, almost what we see, are being changed to, for example, PP plastics or other type of hard plastics. Again, studies, newly published studies showing that microplastics coming to the food chain. And the very last part of my reflection is around what has been also shared earlier. I think all the time we talk about carbon footprint, which is of course a very important KPI, but really looking at the climate impact and the scale, I think when plastic start to degrade, the methane that is produced in the environment, it is unbelievably underestimated in many different contexts. Of course, not in this context. In the report, it is also mentioned, and methane can be up to 80 times more harmful than CO2 for the environment. And it is something I would really love to see also more discussions around that. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'll be looking forward to listening to other inspirational panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max, for the presentation. I hope my sound quality is now a bit better. I'm sorry for the trouble before. I wanted to really thank you for bringing that sort of startup or innovators perspective into this discussion, and also to highlight some of the opportunities around substitutes and also reuse, but also some of the challenges around some of the alternatives that are often talked about, but perhaps not critically analyzed from a holistic perspective, as you have encouraged. And also thank you for highlighting the health dimensions, because I think for many countries in their proposals and in their submissions and statements at the INC, they've emphasized the importance of a plastic treaty that not only protects the environment, but also human health. And so this is something we really need to look at in a holistic way and a cross-cutting way across the treaty to ensure that the kinds of measures and solutions address both the environmental and the health aspects of the plastics crisis. So thank you for bringing that to this discussion. So I'm going to turn next to Daniela Durand, who is a senior legal campaigner on the upstream aspects of the Plastics Treaty, and she works with the Center for International Environmental Law. It's always a pleasure to see you, Daniela. So welcome, looking forward hearing your reflections on the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much to GRID-Arendal and to Jen for the invitation to this webinar and to the launch of the report. I want to start with a sentence from Eduardo Galeano, an Uruguayan author, that says, "To not be mute, one must begin by not being deaf." Let's not be deaf to the lessons of the past. At UNFCCC Spaces, it took us almost 30 years to realize that the key drivers of the climate crisis were fossil fuels. Today, we already know with certainty that the levels of plastic production that we have today are not only a source and a driver of plastic pollution, but are a key driver of the climate crisis as well. And we don't have 30 years to realize that we should have controlled plastic production in the Plastics Treaty. Greenhouse gas emissions, as the report and my previous panelists have showcased, are plastic pollution. With current levels of production, plastics are already accounting for approximately 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and production is going to grow exponentially in the next few years until plastics will consume approximately 15% of the global carbon budget we have left to achieve the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. This is more than the carbon budget that's assigned for aviation, for example. So this number is already huge, highly concerning, and it's still highly conservative. And as the report showcases, and this is something that it's important to take into account, almost 90% of those greenhouse gas emissions come from plastic production, meaning the transformation of fossil fuels into plastic polymers. This means that the climate impacts of plastics are under the scope of the Future Plastics Treaty because they are plastic pollution. And what UNEA Resolution 514, which gives the mandate for the INC, showcases that the objective of this Future Plastics Treaty should be to end plastic pollution. And to achieve that objective, the treaty will have to incorporate obligations to address the climate impacts of plastics, and that means incorporating obligations on plastic production. So from our perspective at CL, what does the Plastics Treaty need to have to effectively address these climate impacts? First, controlling and progressively reducing plastic production, which is polymer production, will be the most important factor in this equation. What evidence is telling us today is that the only way to effectively address the climate impacts of plastics, the only way to align the Plastics Treaty with the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement is to reduce current levels of production. Let's remember that in 99% of cases, plastics come from fossil fuels. Most fossil fuels are used as feedstocks or raw materials, and a way less significant percentage is used as an energy source for producing plastics. And let's also highlight that it's very challenging to decarbonize the production of plastics, and scientific evidence is indicating that, for example, electrifying the process or changing fossil fuel feedstocks for biomass or relying on technologies that have proven not to be scalable or safe, like carbon capture and storage and use, won't have benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC Spaces have a limited scope and outreach to address the use of fossil fuels as feedstocks, so the Plastics Treaty will need to attend the associated climate impacts of this. What this means is that it's not possible to decouple plastic production from fossil fuels and therefore to decouple plastics from significant climate impacts, meaning that we cannot maintain current levels of production and expand them if we want a treaty that is aligned with the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. And in these moments of climate crisis, we just had the hottest year on record with catastrophic consequences, we cannot afford a treaty that is not aligned with this goal. To limit and progressively reduce plastic production, we believe that a global target can be useful and can prove useful, that provides a common goal for action that serves as a benchmark to measure treaty progress. But this needs to be coupled with a mechanism for the parties of the treaty to take action at the national level to achieve that global target. And here, as Galeano said, let's learn
from past mistakes. Under the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contributions have proven woefully inadequate to achieve the 1.5 goal. But we have successful models at the national level for this, like the Montreal Protocol, in which each of the parties of the treaty has progressive phase-down schedules with national reduction targets that increase progressively over time. And the Montreal Protocol has been framed as the most successful MEA in all times. How much do we need to reduce? That's a tricky question, and science still needs to be developed, but we have enough evidence to say that as a minimum, production should be reduced to levels that are aligned with the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. Finally, we believe that the plastics treaty needs to stop production from keep growing. We're expecting production to grow exponentially in the next few decades, and that is not aligned with the 1.5 target. To do that, we need to stop the expansion of production capacity. Right now, more than 1,400 plants to produce plastics that rely and depend on fossil fuels will be constructed in the next 5 years. And in a world that is urgently calling for a just and fair phase out of fossil fuels, this situation will lock in fossil fuel production in the next decades to the point that very soon, in 2028, plastics will be the main driver of oil demand growth globally. I want to close by remembering Galeano's words. Let's allow this treaty not to be mute by not being deaf to the lessons of our UNFCCC past. And it is imperative, not just important, that we do this right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for making a very succinct presentation of why this importance of reduction, of how important reduction is to alignment with the Paris goals, and also making such a clear link between the fossil fuels, expansion of fossil fuels and the expansion of plastic production. And also, I think you also highlighted the importance of the expansion that is currently planned and the need to ensure that we stop the growth of that expansion if we want to have a treaty that's consistent with ending plastic pollution, but also that is aligned with the Paris goals. So thank you, Daniela. I'm going to turn next to Richard Thompson, who is a professor of marine biology and director of the University of Plymouth's Marine Institute, and he's also with the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. Richard, it's my pleasure to hand the floor to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
Yeah. There we go. Hi. Well, listen, thank you very much. I'm Richard Thompson. I'm a marine biologist based at the University of Plymouth in the UK. And as you said, I'm a member of the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. If we can have the first slide, please. Thank you. So the goal of the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty is centered around evidence-based decision-making to provide the best science in pursuant of UNEA Resolution 514. Next slide, please. We're a voluntary network. I come to you as one of the co-coordinators of that network, representing in excess of 320 members from 53 nations, independent academic researchers who are approved via a conflict of interest policy to make sure that our science is independent, it's not conflicted. We're supported by a steering committee and a secretariat. But I emphasize that this is brought to you in a voluntary capacity by the Scientists Coalition. Next slide, please. So I was really delighted to read the report, but also to listen to the explanations from Natalia and Erin and Karen. I really endorse the report and the contents and the clarity of the delivery that you've put across. You really cover off, as far as I can see, most of the key points that we would consider important from the perspective of the Scientists Coalition. So I really want to thank you and acknowledge the hard work that's gone into it. Things that I take away from the report, first of all, are the point that, and our last speaker, Daniela, also touched to this, 85% of these emissions are associated with production rather than the sourcing of the raw material. And so whatever raw material we have, there's going to be emissions associated with that production. And what this really can only point to one thing, is that's that need to drive down production and consumption of plastics, independent really of what the raw material itself might be. You also emphasized the use of materials that may be more sustainable, that maybe contained less carbon. And you emphasize in the report and in the presentations earlier the need for a full life cycle approach. And I'm going to draw on that a little bit further in some of my following slides. But I think it is absolutely critical, if we think about alternatives and substitutes, that we apply the same safety and sustainability criteria that we will need to look at current use of plastics. We need to be sure, in essence, that if we try to move towards materials, to alternative materials or substitute plastics, that we're doing so in a way that doesn't create unintended consequences. And so that full life cycle approach that you've taken here with respect to plastics and climate change would need to be applied to any alternative approaches that we might take. I think also what I really welcome from the report was the recognition that greenhouse gas emissions are associated with the end of life phase that we have at the moment: open burning, landfill, incineration, including waste to energy, and you highlighted the concern about lock-in. And I also welcome the comments on the potential to reduce some of those greenhouse gas emissions by switching to alternative, more circular formats through reuse and circularity, recycling. So I really welcome all of those. And I also very much welcome, and maybe this is obvious from a member of the Scientists Coalition, but you underscore, as we would do, the absolute critical need for a science policy interface, a dedicated science policy interface to the plastics instrument that is provides the best science available in a manner that is not conflicted by competing interests. And I think when you consider the complexity of the issue that we're trying to tackle, such evidence is going to be absolutely essential. So all of those points I really welcome. We go to the next slide, please. You asked me to reflect a little bit in the initial invitation on non-plastic substitutes. So substitutes that are not made of plastic, if you like, alternative materials, not fossil-based minerals and plants, and also on alternative plastics, different types of plastics. And so I wanted to do that for a moment here. You raised both of these topics around substitutes and alternatives. And key phrases that are used are environmentally sound and lower footprint. And you reference the need for a full life cycle analysis, which is exactly the right approach. Low carbon, low water, low energy. But I think that, ultimately the devil will be in the detail here, and it will be about the safety and sustainability criteria associated with those alternatives and substitutes. We need to look at those alternatives and substitutes with the same critical lens that we're currently looking at plastics. And that lens needs to apply to the essentiality of the products if we're to drive down production and consumption, but also any associated chemicals that might be being used. Because I think there is a real risk we could move from one material that is a range of plastic materials that are underperforming to alternatives or substitutes that are not necessarily any better without that full consideration. So I absolutely endorse that, and it will take science to inform that. You talk about in the report low carbon and non-fossil and flag minerals, but also plants as an alternative. And of course, plants contain carbon. And I would stress, as we think about this from the full life cycle approach, that we shouldn't just think about carbon in terms of the carbon emissions. And I'm going to come back to that point in a minute when I talk about the alternatives. So if we move then to the alternatives here, we're perhaps thinking about bio-based, and you flag in the report that some of those materials are perhaps perceived as being more environmentally friendly, when actually they're not necessarily tested to any standard that might really confirm that better environmental footprint. And so it's going to be really important that if we think about switching to alternative plastics, we are really confident that they present better alternatives. I think it's important, you underscore it in the report, making something bio-based doesn't automatically alter its fate at the end of life. It doesn't necessarily make it any more degradable or biodegradable, if indeed that's an attribute that we want, because of course one of the key benefits that's made plastics so successful is actually their durability while in service. So there is a challenge to deliver degradation alongside that. There are also issues if we're switching to carbon-based alternatives of land use. And I think that finally the point I want to make here is around considering carbon more broadly, taking this holistic approach. And I see terminology coming in, particularly in some discussions with UNCTAD and the World Trade Organization around things that are described as waste, agricultural waste, for example, and food waste. And I'm just cautioned because I think, you know, nature doesn't actually have waste. And I caution about removing material from the land that might be seen as an agricultural waste if the current practice is to return that carbon to the land. You know, the leaves of plants, the parts of plants that are not necessarily eaten could be turned into alternative plastics or into substitute plastics. But I question the fact that we might actually be denuding the land and depleting it of some of its important carbon. And then finally, you'd also touch on the use of HS codes and the role of trade. And I think this could be really important here. But again, the detail will be important. You know, something that's perhaps, you know, for argument's sake, classified as a product now made of banana leaves is not necessarily any more sustainable as an alternative if, in order to deliver functionality, those banana leaves have to be impregnated with some kind of resin. So we need to make sure that we've thought about this in the round as we move towards alternatives and substitutes. And in all of that, I think there's going to be a critical role for the science policy interface. So the next slide is my last one, really. If we could just move to the last slide. And just to say, earlier on, you emphasized lack of clarity around definitions of biodegradables and bioplastics and alternatives and substitutes. And I would point you to the website of the Scientists Coalition, where we have provided some policy briefs and fact sheets covering both of those instances. And also, if you're go to the very last slide now, if you're particularly interested in alternatives and substitutes, to the side of the Scientists Coalition, the University of Plymouth will be organising in Ottawa a side event focused on alternatives and substitutes around lunchtime on the 26th of April. So by all means, reach out to me if you'd like an invitation to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, for those reflections. Really useful to have that sort of detailed analysis and to remind us of the importance of careful scientific analysis of these alternatives and substitutes, both their potential and also the challenges. We don't want to have, you know, replace plastics with other harmful substances and materials as well. One of the things that I haven't heard so far in this discussion around reduction is also the emphasis that a number of members have placed in INC discussions, also around avoidable plastics as well. It's not that everything on the market we have to replace. Some of the things were avoidable in the first place, like a huge amount of the plastic packaging is simply avoidable. So we don't have to replace it with another, you know, inefficient, wasteful, or harmful material. And also for those plastics that are on the market, I think that many governments are very keen to ensure, or these plastic products, that they're repairable, reusable, that we extend the product life and durability of these. So not everything needs to be put through the filter of substitution as vital in order to argue for moving it off the market as such. So I think that would just be, and that will also have an impact on achieving this goal of reducing the climate impact of the plastic, you know, of this sector. So that's just some added input from me there. But I'm going to turn. Thank you. It's not. It was just a general reflection. You inspired me with that, Richard. So thank you. I'm going to turn now to our last two speakers, and then hopefully we'll be able to pose a couple of questions to the authors of the report at the end. So first, I have Kartik Verma, who is the Plastic Action Facilitator of the Children and Youth Major Group. So Kartik, over to you, please.
Thank you. So hello everyone. Thank you GRID-Arendal and Geneva Environment Network for giving us opportunity to reflect on this very important report. So ongoing to this report, we find it very informative in specific in establishing the relation relationship between climate and plastic. The reason why I say is that we as a constituency, when we were in time to the preparation of the written submission to INC2 and even INC3, we had a huge round of discussion that what things we are putting forward. But this aspects of plastic was like not much reflected in our submission. This is like one of the reasons why we emphasize that why it is important. But before like coming to the report, that what specifically we looked into, we had around like three virtual roundtables on and one workshop during the Youth Environment Assembly, which we had just before UNIA at UNEP headquarters, like making a potential discussion on INC process and the draft for INC4. So there was like few things which outcomes like we see as the outcome of this consultation which we had in specific to this report was like transboundary waste management, which have been well emphasized in this report, that what consequences it have when we see in the climate perspective. And also there was well mentioned that not looking much further to the NDC, but to the global goals in regard to the national action plans, which were like one of the most priority during the consultation, which we pointed out. But in regard to this report, that few things which we observed and we'll be taking forward was like the summary of on the different MEAs and their work of intersectionality and relation to the plastic and climate, making like various note, either it's national action plan, control measures, or obligation under such as like Paris Agreement, Minamata Convention, Basel Convention, and other. Which may and which will be interlinked into the future plastic treaty, as we see and we will be seeing during INC4 and further. One thing more which we have been looking is to the alternative feedstock, as the previous speaker, Professor Richard, also mentioned on the bio-based feedstocks, because we have mentioned this in our written submission during INC3 as a sustainable alternative and in different regards. But as report specifically mentioned and point out that what other consequences it can have on environment, because maybe like on the different hand, that it may have more like environmental, it may not like have the more carbon equivalent release of carbon equivalent, but this may not be a conventional method uh, to see as an alternative until and unless the different aspects are not being clearly observed and seen as that what it is the well way to proceed further or not. But on different note, what we also pointed is on the use and reuse and the waste management of plastic, which have very less carbon print, but due to the ill treatment and other factors, which causes much worse condition, as in a case plastic entering in the ocean, which creates much more potential risks when we think of cleanup operations and to the other note. So like summing up to the entire report, we see that as a youth, which we already have been pushing to the more fact-based things and more research, more concrete information, so that this entire negotiation process is driven by scientific evidence, not just only on the much overall discussion. So as a youth, we really look forward for much more information, much more research, and much more concrete things which we really found in this report, and which will be taking forward in our further consultation to INC4. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Kartik, for that intervention as well, and really fantastic to see the emphasis on science, both in terms of understanding the impacts of plastics, but also the impacts of some of the alternatives and solutions that have been put on the table as well. So thank you for that. We have just about 6 more minutes on the call, but I want to be sure to have our last speaker intervene, and then I'll provide an opportunity for the authors to respond to some of these comments. So I'm going to turn now to Lena Estrada, who is the Indigenous Peoples representative from the major, from the major groups facilitating committee of UNEP. So over to you, Lena, please.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you. Okay, like indigenous representative, and in the context of the climate impacts of plastics and the global actions to stem climatic change and end plastic pollution that the world is experiencing and suffocating humanity, it is necessary to think and reflect on the action and policies that have led us to this situation. The indiscriminate and irresponsible use of fossil fuels, which are the raw material of plastics, and the consequent contamination of Mother Earth, the Amazon rivers, lakes, lagoons, marine and high mountain ecosystems around the world, and a lot of effects on life on the planet and the survival of the human species. This irresponsible action promoted from the economic system of numerically majority society must stop to protect the life of the planet, cultures, peoples, and humanity. It's important to remember that 99% of plastic come from fossil fuels, and these are extracted from our territories, the indigenous territories. The second, the climatic impacts of plastics mostly associate will affect most indigenous people territories. The treaty, plastic treaty needs to address those impacts by reducing plastic production. Alternative like bioplastic will affect indigenous people rights because of the risks of affectations to all indigenous territories. Indigenous people systems are the key to solve the crisis. No, that is important. We are pushing to for the indigenous knowledge system can account inside of the treaty plastic at the same level of scientific knowledge. No, on the other hand, the indigenous peoples as knowledge holders are open to all parties and all other sectors involved in plastic treaty negotiation for relationship building and information sharing at all times throughout plastic treaty negotiation, including during INC and intersessional periods. The indigenous caucus are active from INC 1. We was in INC 2 and INC 3, and now we will go to INC 4. This is our history, and we are pushing for our rights, indigenous people rights, indigenous people human rights, and indigenous territory rights, and of course for the life of the humanity. No, But it's important in this process, increasing the indigenous participation through meaningful conversation with the INC, with the INC authorities, no? Doing so will align with the precedent set by other negotiations for multilateral environment agreements. On another hand, we hope to be strong the mobilization and to finalize the plastic treaty will be successful if and only if this address the plastic crisis from the origin, no? And the origin is the plastic, the plastic production, no? Capping and pacing down production of plastic will protect communities from the harms caused by this production, and will also enable effective measures across the rest of the plastic life cycle. Anything less will not solve the crisis. Making sure indigenous rights and demand are disseminated meaningful across the text is crucial to achievement the goals. I think like indigenous people, we are now in the text in different parts, 27 times. At the same time, our indigenous nobles are including, but we need to push to separate the indigenous people from local communities. That is another process that we are pushing because we are different groups, and we need to separate these groups, the indigenous people, from local communities. That is the mistake in the documents, and sometimes they mention like we are one group together, and this is not correct, no? So we don't have mentions about the indigenous territories. So we need to push because all our territories are have the affections for the life cycle production. No, I think that is all, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lena, and thank you also for highlighting the importance of addressing the root causes of plastic pollution and highlighting the importance of plastic production and a systemic approach, and also to understanding the impacts of plastic pollution across the life cycle for Indigenous peoples, and also the role of Indigenous knowledge as part of the solutions to plastic pollution as well. So I'm going to turn now, we have running short of time. I would just want to ensure that everyone knows that all of the presentations will be available online afterwards. There have been a great set of questions and answers, some of which have been answered by speakers in the chat, but we've also noted all of those, and so can get back to some of the people around that. But before closing, I wanted to turn back to Karen Raubenheiber, who's one of the lead authors on the report, for her to give her sort of closing remarks on what are some of the key messages that she would like us to take away from this discussion today, and also from their report. So over to you, Karen.
Great, thanks, Carolyn, and thanks for your help with the moderating. So for me, I think there's three key takeaways. Firstly, as Lena said, reducing production of primary polymers. Secondly, bringing greenhouse gas emissions into the design criteria, all aspects of design. And then also including greenhouse gas emissions in any framework that we develop for indicators and targets, so that we can really start tracking it and working towards reducing that. Thank you.
That's a remarkably short and sweet study summary for such a comprehensive study. So, well, from my part, I just want to thank you as authors for putting this report on the table. I think that it's really critical that we continue to build knowledge and understanding of these issues. Negotiators are very busy. The public has a lot of issues that they're trying to process and different stakeholders, but putting this together in one place is really, really helpful. And also the fact that you went through both of the processes and showed some of the connections and complementarities, but also that different actions and measures may be able to take, will be necessary in both processes. And to give some suggestions on what they may look like very concretely, I think is a really great contribution. So thank you again for this work, for making sure that this issue stays high on the agenda. And thank you also to the other speakers among the co-authors, and also to all of the panelists for sharing your reflections today. And finally, I'd like to thank again Ambassador Dalnivalu for making the opening remarks, highlighting politically why this issue is so important. And also our wonderful friends and colleagues at the Geneva Environment Network for including this topic as part of their Beat Plastic Pollution dialogues. So from my side, thank you all again for joining us today. And we look forward to sharing the summary and the presentations with all of you online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you all for your participation today. Just flagging something important is the next sessions of the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues. We have 2 sessions next week, one where we will discuss biodiversity with our friends from IUCN and other stakeholders, looking at the importance of biodiversity into the new treaty. And another session next week, we'll look at chemicals in the plastics treaty, perspectives on protecting human health, and the chair of the ANC process will join us for that one. So those 2 sessions are on 26th and 28th of March. And finally, one looking at trade and looking at what happened also at the last ministerial conference of the World Trade Organization. So stay tuned, and thank you all for joining us today. And as Caroline mentioned, documents, all the presentations that were made, we are available on the website, and then they will be made available in the next minutes. And this is just a start. We heard very interesting inputs today, and so this is just a start. Don't hesitate to engage with the speakers and with their teams if you are interested in this topic. Thank you very much.